Hi, I'm Tanya Gaw, and I'm here at the What in the World conference, and I'm here with Alex Newman, who's joined us. He's going to be special guest speaker, and Alex is an international journalist, educator, author, and consultant. I'm going to promote a wonderful book that you've written, Crimes of the Educators. And many of the countries around the world are being affected by decisions made at the UN level. And Alex has co-authored this book with Dr. Samuel Blumenfeld. And Alex, we're just so pleased to have you here with us today. And could you tell us a little bit about yourself? You have a long list of accomplishments.
Well, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here with you. As for myself, I mean, you kind of gave a good overview, and I do a lot of writing. And really my goal is just to try to glorify God and expose the truth. And one of the Bible verses I always go to is Ephesians 5:11. Reprove evil, expose evil. And so I kind of use that as my guiding motto in my work. I like to expose and reprove evil. And so that kind of got me into journalism and writing about education. There's so much going on in education and in international relations, the United Nations. That's kind of why I focused on those areas, because there's just so much going on there that's frankly wicked and that ought to be exposed, that ought to be brought into the light. And so I mean, that's me pretty much.
And what was the tipping point for you? You're from the United States. We're being deeply affected by it here in Canada in the education system. This plan to basically use our kids as agents of change. We know that it's been going on for many, many years, but more profoundly when it comes to this sexual education program. And I understand that when Obama was president, he had forcibly put pressure on schools to accept transgenderism, opening up the bathrooms to boys going into girls' change rooms and bathrooms, and if not, I believe he was going to pull federal funding if they didn't comply. Yeah. So was this a huge motivator for you? Were you working on this prior to that, or how did it come about?
Yeah, this book we actually, Crimes of the Educators, we wrote back in 2014 and 2015, which was a little bit before a lot of this happened. The homosexual marriage had not even come about yet. That came in 2015 in a Supreme Court decision. So a lot of that was still in the closet, so to speak, and it happened very, very quickly. And that has become a big subject of my work. I think a lot of parents don't realize how far it's gotten. We just wrote a story the other day on one of my education blogs. They caught on camera a senior official at a school district in California explaining that they have to teach the children about pedophilia and pederasty because this is a sexual orientation. And when you think about the implications of that, they're now saying that you can't discriminate based on sexual orientation. Now they're teaching the kids that pedophilia is a sexual orientation. Project the lines. Does that mean that schools now need to hire pedophiles? Does that mean that churches now need to hire pedophiles to run their Sunday school ministries? And when you said that 10 years ago, that this is where this was all going, people said, "Oh, you're just being hysterical. You're just being alarmist," and yet now it's all happening. So I think the reason why I focused so much on education, and it's a little bit strange because I had probably one of the best educations anybody could ever ask for. I went to very elite private schools around the world. And I received, honestly, a very good education. It was very heavy on the globalist indoctrination. They're kind of training, future globalist managers, if you will. So I had a very good education. But then I saw, what was happening in the public school system. What really got my interest was Common Core, which I know you guys don't have that here in Canada. But during the Obama administration, they began this process of imposing national standards on the states. Traditionally, the federal government had nothing to do with education. It's not authorized in our Constitution, and in fact our Constitution specifically prohibits anything that's not authorized. So they really have no authority to do this. But then Obama came out and wanted to push these crazy national standards on the states, and he was very successful in doing that. They used, I call it bribe money. They took federal money and they said, "We'll give you federal money if you accept these." And, the carrot and the stick, of course, some bludgeoning. Well, if you don't accept this, then we're going to do this, that, and the other to you. And they got most of the states to agree. And that really set off alarm bells for me. That was right when I was getting out of university. That was in 2010. So it was one of my first big projects. And as I dug into this, I realized that this is worse than just the federal government nationalizing education. This is the federal government working to dumb down the American populace.
Yes.
I interviewed, for example, both of the people. They had this thing they call the Common Core Validation Committee. And this was supposed to validate the Common Core. It was an official committee put together by the Common Core people, and they only had 2 subject matter experts on this committee. So I called them both. I had to see what was going on, and they both told me, I refuse to sign off on this. This is going to be a disaster. Right. The English language expert, Dr. Sandra Stotsky, she said this is going to reduce the critical thinking abilities of children. We're taking out all the great literature. No, this is crazy. And she didn't even disagree with the idea of national standards. She just didn't want the kids to come out dumb on the other side. So that was a huge wake-up call to me. Then we had on the mathematics side Dr. James Milgram, a professor at Stanford University in mathematics, and he also said, I'm not going to sign off on this. It's confusing. It doesn't make any sense. Some of it is even based on incorrect math. Mm-hmm. And I'm thinking, whoa, so we now have national standards, some of which are based on incorrect math. And that was a big wake-up call for me. When I saw what they were doing, I realized this is the heart of all the other battles. Right? If we lose on the education battle, we're going to lose on all the other battles that we care about. And as I progressed into my research, I realized it wasn't just dumbing down; it was also dangerous indoctrination. Turning the kids against the churches, against their parents. So that was really alarming to me. And over the years, I just recognized that education is kind of the center point, the focal point of so many other things that are going wrong, that are going completely haywire in our society.
Well, and I think they know that if you change the minds of your children, you change the future. And when we take a look at where this is going to lead to the future, as you say, one of the profound things I've been considering a lot right now is the ability for society at large to think critically with common sense. But this is what they're producing en masse from our schools. So I don't think it's any coincidence that Canada is going through the very same thing, maybe under a different name, but it's all the same agenda. And do you agree that the UN has become very heavily involved in the decisions that the nations are being compelled to make? I know that they've put what's called an LGBTQ czar in place, and for instance, he's got a 5-point plan, one of them being to decriminalize sodomy. One of the first things that Justin Trudeau did when he came into office was lowered the age of anal sex from 18 to 16. So when you were talking previously about the movement to normalize pedophilia, I think there's initially a sense of grooming going on in order to do that. The pride flags, the pride parades, there are pedophilia flags. They're trying to coordinate with the pride parades and whatnot and be inclusive. And there's a bit of a battle going on there amongst themselves. So it's so big. And if we don't really take some very firm steps to elect people into office who understand the complexity of this and the seriousness of this, our countries are in trouble. But we can look at Europe and the UK, Ireland, we're all being pressured, by the same force. And I know in Canada there's a big movement to say pull out of the UN. They no longer serve the purpose of what they did. And now that they're attacking our kids and they're going after them, mother bears are out, right? Yeah. Daddy bears are out. Yeah. So how do you feel about the UN and the United States? I mean, I know President Trump is making some firm moves to pull out of certain UN organizations. Do you think he'll go the whole way?
I certainly hope so. I think it would just be one of the most amazing developments in my lifetime. And Trump has done some really good things. Mm-hmm. You mentioned the UN's education policies now trickling down around the world. That is exactly what is happening. A lot of people don't realize. The UN has an education agency, the UN Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, UNESCO. And I've spent many years researching, writing, exposing this. It was actually run by a communist until just recently, an actual communist. Mm-hmm. And early in 2018, they put out these global standards for comprehensive sexuality education. They called it CSE. And it is shocking. I mean, they want to teach 5-year-old children things that you literally can't say in polite company, even with adults. These are not things to be discussed. That's what they want to teach 5-year-old children. And it's more than just confusing the children and you know, grooming them for sexual activity and this kind of stuff, and for fornication and, you know, all these different sins that they want them involved in. It's being used as a battering ram against the church. You know, we see that now even in the United States, founded by Christians for Christians, you know, the most tolerant society maybe ever, precisely because it was founded by Christians. But now they're using this to destroy the churches. And I spent a lot of time living in Sweden, and you can kind of get a sneak preview of where this is all going. The national government there actually did an investigation of the Bible, and this was years ago. The Justice Ombudsman there, somebody had filed a complaint and said the Bible violates their hate speech laws. And the government concluded that it does violate the hate speech laws. It's not practical to ban it yet, but you know, this is a problem. And actually, they proposed one solution could be to change the words in the Bible. I'm thinking, you know, you guys don't understand how this works. That's God's word. You don't get to change it. That's what God said. They're throwing pastors in prison. You know, a very famous case. They arrested a Pentecostal preacher, Oke Green, for preaching against homosexuality in his church. And, you know, we can disagree about the words he used. He called homosexuality a cancer on society, and he was arrested for that and put in jail. The same thing is happening in Britain now. They're arresting evangelists, street preachers, pastors, you know, sending spies into churches to, you know, see what people are saying in their sermons, whether they're preaching from the Bible about what it says on, you know, homosexuality and other types of sins. So what's happening here, and it is coming down from the UN level, this is, you know, how it's getting into the schools. They have these global standards. They've been working on this for a very long time. And one of the things that I've showed in a presentation that I'm going to be giving all across the United States here in the coming months, I go back to the 1990s when this really got started. They brought in this documentary produced by a pair of lesbians called It's Elementary, talking to children about gay issues. And so they started getting this into classrooms all around America. And, you know, for younger Americans who don't remember what it was like back then, and, you know, I'm certainly among them, I was out of the country, but sodomy was a crime across much of the United States until the early 2000s. You know, it was a criminal offense until the Supreme Court struck it down in a case involving the state of Texas. And they prepared the way very carefully and very meticulously in the schools. And so they actually had, you can see this in the documentary, they have these little kids say, okay, pretend like you're a judge. And you know, there's this discriminatory ban on homosexuals being married, and some people think that that's important because only a man and a woman can be married according to their religious views. Other people think that's wrong and that discriminates. And so what do you think, little children? And of course they all come to the politically correct conclusion, well, that is discriminatory. We should, you know, not having any concept of what a marriage is. You know, God created marriage before government, and it's a reflection of the relationship between Christ and his church. It's not something that governments can just redefine or undefine. But they had the little kids thinking this way, and then reinforced by Hollywood propaganda, and, you know, getting progressively more extreme into the schools. And then, you know, now you can see where we are. 20 years after that began, they had exactly what they prepared the children for. The Supreme Court stepped in and created a right to a homosexual marriage, something that until, you know, 10 years earlier had never even been heard of, you know, much less thought of as a realistic possibility or a policy. And now we see, you know, on national television, mainstream television, you have child drag queens, you know, parading around in, you know, sexy outfits. You have news that child drag queens are performing at homosexual bars and clubs in New York with grown men throwing money. Yeah, pedophiles, actually. They've caught several pedophiles now.
Yes, recently there's been a report of another sexual predator that has used the drag queen scenario and to abuse children. And there's just so many things going through my head as you're talking. I mean, when we talk about the UN's involvement, and we think about the Human Rights Council pushing for the change of including gender expression and gender identity. So, you know, that kind of was forced on the member states to comply comply and start to include this into their policies and laws. And so provincially throughout Canada, the human rights commissions have gone ahead. The Premier, for instance, of BC back in 2016, without anybody knowing, went ahead and changed our codes to include gender expression and gender identity. 100 sex activists showed up to vote, but nobody else knew about it. So it passed first, second, and third reading in one day. That was in July. In September, they launched the beginning of the SOGI 123 resource into several of our schools. I think there was about a dozen. As of this last fall, it went into all schools. So what they did was they knew that opposition would be coming because the program is so vile in what it is teaching, but they wanted it to come across as an anti-bullying agenda because children were being bullied. Well, we've already got great teachings in the school system already on bullying. It was unnecessary, but it was certainly a great guise to bring it in on. Yeah. Right? And so now that people are aware, when I joined a culture guard, Carrie Simpson came out of the gates as soon as we found out about this 2 years. And this lady is working hard in BC to turn this around. And, we're not only looking at the UN as being obsolete, we're looking at the human rights commissions throughout the provinces throughout the country, because they are overstepping. It's giving special privilege to minority groups. And it's shutting the voice of majority. So there's hate speech, and you're being charged, before the human rights commissions and tribunals. It could be up to $55,000. Bill Watcott was just charged for bringing awareness. Yeah. So this is getting to be pretty scary when our rights under the Constitution and our rights under the Charter are being ignored and supported by these kangaroo courts and whatever a judge happens to be feeling on the day. Yeah. So it's very concerning, but again, there's the UN's hand in this massive push to get this agenda throughout the world.
Yeah. And I think that's so crucial for people to understand that this is part of an agenda, and it's very effective. Actually, there's been a lot of studies now in the United States. Just recently, the University of California in Los Angeles, UCLA, did a study, and they found that now 27% of children in California are from ages 12 to 17 are so-called gender nonconforming. So, boys who reject that they're boys and girls who reject that they're girls. In Sweden, according to the chief psychiatrist at one of the big children's hospitals, the number of transgender children is increasing by 100% every year. Now there's been some polls in the United States that less than half of American kids identify as heterosexual. They're one of the LGBT things. When I was a kid, and that wasn't all that long ago, this was completely unheard of. I never in my entire childhood met a transgender, a boy who didn't recognize that he was a boy, or a girl that didn't recognize she was a girl. And this goes to the core of truth, right? God created male and female. And so what the schools now are doing with the collaboration of the United Nations, with the collaboration of our federal government in the United States, which is pushing this all over the world, at least it was during the Obama term, they are waging a war not just on traditional morality, and they're actually going after objective truth. I mean, you don't have to be a Christian to say, no, you have XX chromosomes, you have XY chromosomes, you're this or you're that. And yet now that objective statement of fact has suddenly become unspeakable. So, project the lines. Where is this all going? And you need to recognize that we're only at the start. And if they're allowed to continue, this is going to be used as a steamroller to flatten the church, to persecute the church. We're already seeing it now. We have some of these human rights commissions in the United States. Now they're trying to force Christians to celebrate LGBT weddings and things like this. And it's getting very intense.
Right. Everybody heard about him. I mean, if you speak out against it in opposition, they just demonize you. Yep. They're taking unscientific ideologies and pressing on them like, somebody's taken a lie and calling it their truth, and they're standing on it. And they're repeating. And for those who don't have the awareness or the again, the ability to think critically, like our youth who they're targeting, they begin to accept that as a truth.
Yep.
And kids are so impressionable, and they love a trend, and their little rebellious spirits love to, march on a cause. So they're hitting them even environmentally. But this transgender and LGBTQ movement is something that is damaging the core of their being. And, to give children the age of 8 the opportunity to go on life-changing permanent medications such as puberty blockers, to allow kids to have their bodies mutilated through surgical procedures that cannot be undone. This is abuse, and we've got what should have been trusted elected officials in positions who are not doing their job and standing up to protect the family, to protect faith, and to protect our kids and society at large, because this is doing a lot of damage.
Yeah, and the terribly ironic thing is that they tell people who speak out against these things that they're being hateful, when really quite the opposite is true. If you tell a boy that he can become a girl by undergoing surgical mutilation, that's hateful. The American College of Pediatricians has called that child abuse, and I agree entirely. You now have a school in Minnesota that took a child for a sex change surgery, so-called, against the wishes of the parents, and now there's a lawsuit about it, but his private parts have been removed and they're not coming back, and that's hateful. If you truly love people, you tell them the truth about all these things. In California now, we just covered this the other day, they're teaching the children, and this is in the curricula, it's backed by the state, that anal sex with a condom is safe. If you actually look at the government's own data, the CDC shows that only 70% of the time will a condom protect against HIV infection. So 30% of the time, those children who believe what the government schools are teaching them are going to end up with AIDS, with HIV, an incurable, potentially deadly, deadly disease. That's hateful. To subject a child to that, to use lies to convince a child, that is, in my opinion, the epitome of hate. You're damaging that child's soul, their entire life.
Their emotions.
And for what? And for what? The loving people are the ones who are telling them the truth. The truth is love, and lies are hate.
Yeah, and I'd say it takes courage to love in this day and age.
It does.
You have to be courageous to love enough to speak the truth, because you know that the backlash is coming. And quite frankly, I've got a spine of steel at this point.
Yeah.
I love kids. I just see what is happening, and my heart is breaking for them. It's breaking for the families that are being forced into these situations to deal with their children who have been indoctrinated into this thought, where the thought was presented to them. As you say, we would have never heard about this as kids. When we think of transgenderism, it's something like 0.03% of the population. This is why we didn't hear about it as kids. And now that it's being added into the resources, and they've even done it so intricately that you can't pull your child out. You can't opt your child out because it's throughout the curriculum. And so that's why our kids are being exposed. That's why the level of awareness has heightened. That's why we've got more kids who are looking into this. And we've got one father here in BC who Carrie Simpson is supporting and fighting for, whose 14-year-old biological daughter has been struggling with the thought that she, may be a boy trapped in a girl's body, and she was brought to a specialist at Children's Hospital, and right away they wanted to put her on puberty blockers. He began to research it, and he sees how harmful it will be for his biological daughter, and his rights were overturned. He's been told that, he does not have say or control. So we've got a 14-year-old person who is making decisions for themselves when they're not allowed to vote. They can't get a driver's license. They're not old enough to drink. And in Canada, they're not old enough to buy marijuana. Yet they're old enough to make these decisions over their body. And 85 to 90% of children who struggle with their identity work through to a normal heterosexual lifestyle if encouraged to do so.
Yep. We're having the same problems in the United States. In fact, the parents lost custody of their daughter over an issue like this. The court ruled that the parents were not being supportive in the gender transition. And to use a kind of a rough analogy, imagine a girl who had bulimia or anorexia and inaccurately believed herself to be obese. Everyone would still recognize that you're obviously not obese, you just think that. And if the girl said, I'm obese, none of us would dream of encouraging that delusion and saying, oh, you really are, maybe you should go get liposuction. That would just be grotesque, it would be cruel, it would be ridiculous. And yet when a little girl says, I think I might be a boy trapped in a girl's body, instead of saying, no dear, that of course you're not, you're just a girl, we encourage, the state, the government, it comes in and encourages that delusion and proposes outlandish medical quote-unquote treatments. I mean, this is really quackery, this is not medicine. And this is devastating to people. I've talked to former transgenders who have undergone this process, and they regret it with every fiber of their being. It's a tragedy of immense proportions. And to have the government teaching children that this is not only acceptable, but that it's good, that it's cool, that it's wholesome, that it's courageous. I agree with the American College of Pediatricians. That is institutionalized child abuse.
Yes.
It's taking place in classrooms all over the world, especially all over the Western world. I think parents need to be aware of the threat to their children of allowing them to be in these institutions.
And when you were speaking, it's funny that you brought up the anorexia and bulimia analogy, because that's something that I've used. And when we're taking a look at this in the school system, would we be teaching kindergartners how to throw up? Would we be celebrating that? Would we have parades encouraging this? No, you know what? We know it's a serious matter, and we'd say there is a psychological component here, and this child needs assistance. They need counseling. I know that this is also going on in the United States, but the effort to ban what they call conversion therapy, which really that word is something I believe, again, to demonize the process of receiving counseling. Many individuals who have who recognize or call themselves transgender or are struggling with their identity, gay or lesbian, statistically, a lot of them were abused, whether sexually, emotionally, as children. So by banning conversion therapy, we're now taking away that right and that opportunity for the kids that have been harmed by abuse to actually get the help that they need so that they can have the best chance at a functional life. We have a NDP MP here in Canada right now who's trying to put a full ban on conversion therapy, and not only for parents, saying you're not allowed as a parent to take your child for counseling, you are not allowed to take your child to another country for counseling, and if you do, we want to make sure the criminal code is changed to make sure that you will be charged for that, and it will be a criminal offense. That's invasive. So we have two different categories, I believe, where the battle is at. We have the gay and lesbian community, who wanted the right to love who they chose to love, and they wanted society to accept that. Then we've got the political LGBTQ sex activist lobby group with all of their propaganda, who are using the platform of the gay and lesbian community to invasively invade society with their ideology. And it's gone so overreaching that they're now doing more damage to the gay and lesbian community, because now people individually and at large in organizations and groups are building up, and they're opposing this. And in turn, then the government, who's part of this agenda, wants to call you a hater, you're intolerant. So it's a vicious attack. They're using mind warfare. Our virtues as a nation are goodness, kindness, tolerance, and they're using that against us. They're villainizing, the people who are courageous and loving enough to speak for truth.
It is a demonization campaign, and it is a total assault on our freedom of speech, on our freedom of religion. And it's all based on this idea that that the sin is a part of somebody's identity. I think that's not only a lie, it's something that's very wrong to tell somebody. If you commit fornication, if you are unfaithful to your spouse and commit adultery, that doesn't mean that an adulterer is who you are. It's not your identity. It's just something that you were involved in. And Paul tells us very clearly, such were some of you. So, the goal is not to celebrate that, hey, I'm an adulterer and I'm proud of my adultery and I'm going to go and parade that in the streets. The goal is to say, well, hey, that's not who I am. That's something that I need to work on and leave behind. And now we're being told that you're not allowed to even say that. And I think people need to recognize too the broader consequences of this, that as we move further and further away from the truths that God has revealed to us, not only in His Word, a lot of this can be deduced just from the creation. Romans 1 tells us that we can tell a lot about God's attributes just from what He's created. We can tell certain things about human sexuality, what it was designed for, how it was supposed to work. We're being told now that these things that have been part of the Christian ethos for thousands of years are somehow wrong and need to be stamped out, need to be punished. And as we move into this kind of post-Christian era, if you will, we're not going to just be confusing the children and normalizing and celebrating sin. We're going to realize, I think here very soon, that all of these wonderful fruits that came with our Christian civilization are going to be gone too. People think the prosperity and the human rights, that's just all some accident and we deserve it or something like that. These are all the fruits of having a Christian civilization. Even the concept of human rights itself comes from the Christian worldview. Why do we have human rights? We have human rights because God created us and God made us in His image. And God said you have a right to life because He said thou shalt not murder. So it's God who gave us human rights. When you separate God and what He's told us from human rights, you end up completely destroying the concept. And as we move away from the Christian worldview, we're going to see that we're going to lose all these things that we have started to take for granted. And I think at that point it's going to become rather unpleasant. And we're going to be told that, it was the Christians who caused this, or it was the free market. We'll end up taking the blame, when in reality the reason why we're going in this negative direction is precisely because we've departed from these truths that God has revealed to us.
Yeah, I think definitely, our countries are under attack. I know that in Canada, I made it my mission to shout on the mountaintops that Canada is indeed a Christian nation. People want to call us a secularist nation, but we're not. It was inherited through our British Commonwealth. Yep. It's embedded in our Magna Carta. It gives us the permission to believe or not to believe. It gives us that right. If we look at countries around the world that are under a different authority, a different governance, they don't have those rights. Those rights are stifled. And I think the more as well, if we were to turn to another subject, say about immigration, in the infiltration of political Islam, here again is where we need to embrace, we need to recognize what a Christian society, what a Christian culture does for us, the freedoms that it permits us. Yeah. Others are living under oppression. And so I think hand in hand, Canadians are going to have to recognize that social issues are just as important as the financial issues, which seems to be the main topic, going into this next election. That's the focus right now, but there's many organizations across the country working on the social issues, calling on leaders to address this, because you can't have a balanced government, a balanced, well-functioning society without the two. Yeah. Fiscal responsibility and social responsibility.
Yeah, I agree with you entirely. And one of the things that I've done is just look around the world. Look at all of human history, and what you'll see very quickly is that where the light of truth was not shining bright, society was not a nice place to be. I mean, Scandinavia, for example. I spent a lot of time in Scandinavia. Before the gospel arrived to Scandinavia, it was perpetual warfare. It was sacrificing children to demon gods in the streets, under the guise of appeasing the gods or some such thing. It was rape, plunder. Everybody knows the Vikings, right? Before the gospel came to these people, They were living in darkness. They were living in barbarism. And we shouldn't be ashamed to say that. The light of the gospel and the truth of God's word sets us free. It enables us to build a good society. And he wrote his laws in all of our hearts. That's true. So everybody has an innate understanding that murder is wrong and that stealing is wrong and these types of things. But until you have truth, your society does not look as God intended it to look. And certainly I would never claim that America or Canada or any other society was perfect, but we tried to emulate those ideas. We made them the foundation of our civilizations. If you read the writings of our founding fathers in America, for example, they were Christian, and they were unashamedly Christian. And they, even the very first people who came, the Pilgrims, they signed the Mayflower Compact, and they told us why they were coming: for the glory of God, to spread the light of the gospel, to advance the kingdom of Christ. And that is why America ended up being the freest, most prosperous society in the world, in human history. That is why, and we shouldn't be ashamed to say that. And we shouldn't try to erase our history and say, oh no, we weren't a Christian nation, we were a secular nation. That's simply not true. It's a lie, and that's being erased. To go back to the schools, our children are not learning about these things. They're not learning any of this. In fact, they're learning that Christianity is evil and that it's false. And they're being taught in their science class that science proves that billions of years and random chance caused a cell to turn into a fish, to turn into a monkey, to turn into a human, and God doesn't exist. This is crazy talk. It's self-evidently untrue. Our founders recognized, they actually said it was a self-evident truth that we're all created and that we're all endowed by our Creator with inalienable rights. Now we're being told that you can't say that in a government school because that's religious. Well, our founders said it was a self-evident truth. It is a self-evident truth, and we need to go back to that understanding, or the consequences are going to be very, very serious. And I think we're starting to see that now. The fruit of this departure from truth is leading to the kind of societal collapse that we're seeing now. And, to speak on the immigration issue you mentioned, I think what we're seeing right now is a full frontal attack on everything that God has ordained. So, we know God has ordained marriage and family. So we see this relentless war on marriage and family. We know that God has ordained nation states, right? God separated the people of the world into nations. And there's a reason why he did that. In fact, he was very upset with us when we tried to create this global system and build this tower. He got really mad, right? And for our own benefit, he separated us into nations with different tongues. And now there's this concerted effort to undermine that. And you see it even more extreme in certain parts of Western Europe now, where the natives of these places are now a minority in their own cities. Right? I think London is a very good example.
It's happening here. Here in Surrey, the South Asian community has moved in, and in Richmond, it's the Asian community. And in and of itself, there isn't a problem with immigration, people immigrating, but the key is integration and assimilation. Otherwise, we have nations building within nations, creating their own schools. You can't stand at the bank or the grocery store and understand the language being spoken around you. That's a sadness to me. That I can't stand there and have a conversation with the person next to me. I can't have a conversation with my neighbor. It's causing division. Justin Trudeau, diversity is our strength. He's a walking contradiction. He really is. And it's breaking my heart, and I'm seeing that, as well, as a Christian, how do we minister to our neighbor if we, don't speak the same language? The division is growing more and more.
Yeah. And I think that's
we're losing our rights.
We are. And I think that's strictly by design. And I know we're just about out of time here, but what we're seeing is, this deliberate effort, because what's happening, and I saw this happen in Sweden, I saw it happen in Germany. You wake up one day and suddenly you're surrounded by people who don't speak your language, who don't share your culture, who don't have anything in common with your history. And so you wake up and you say, well, what is even the purpose of having a nation state? Let's just have a European superstate, or better yet, in their view, a global government, right? And that is where this is all heading. This is a strategic attack on one of the institutions that God has created. And the purpose, I think, is very clear: to bring about this evil world system that they're trying to build.
Right, and I think that we, as not only individuals, but as citizens of nations, we need to start standing up. We need to start speaking out against this. We need to be aware of who we're voting into office.
Yeah.
We have a huge responsibility to make sure that the people we're voting for understand the magnitude of this and are willing to speak against it and defend our sovereignty, our individual sovereignties within our nations.
Yeah.
And because whatever we were founded on was working for us. And again, that's a Christian nation.
Yeah.
Well, Alex, I just want to thank you so much, for being with us today. And I know you'll be speaking at the What in the World is Going On conference this weekend. We're looking forward to what you have to say. And again, I want to really promote your book, Crimes of the Educators. And I know as well that you have your own website, libertysentinel.org. And I welcome people to come and check you out and learn more about you because you have, amazing things to say.
Well,
so thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Okay.